Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Welcome to our session. We're going through this very, very important book, Transcendent God, Rational World, and Maturidi Theology. So, we did the first video where we just basically introduced the book to you. It's a very important book, and I think every Muslim who is serious about their faith intellectually should engage with this book. It's an excellent book in the English language. It's an important book. So the chapter that we're looking at is the first chapter in the book. The chapter is called Tradition and Reason. It's split into a number of sections, 4 sections to be precise. First section looks through Imam Maturidi's conceptualization and his own epistemic commitments. And we look at this in terms of contrasting this with what's called non-foundational approach, with people who had different approaches to him later on. So people who inherited his tradition, but actually took a very different outlook to Imam Maturidi himself. And that's going to be the content of the next video. The next section looks at how it gauges the implicit grounding of his work within a range of pre-existing philosophical ideas and theological discourses. And I'm going to do that in the next video. What I want to do, though, just to get straight into it, is to go through the first section of this chapter. It's an important chapter, important section of as well. And it's called Tradition and Reason in Maturidi Epistemology. In other words, according to Imam Maturidi and his outlook, he used both reason to look at what he received and what came to him, but he also looked at what had come from him to him from, for example, the Quran and the collection of hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, as well. Now, a very important book which is taught in nearly every madrasa across the Muslim world is what's called Aqidah Nasafiyya. It's a very important book. It's actually one of the most important texts on Aqidah or Creed within the Sunni theological tradition. Okay, and the book was written very early on, what's called the classical period, by somebody in the Transoxanian region called Abu Hafs al-Nasafi. He died in 537 Hijri or 1142. And it's a very important book because it summarizes the key creedal commitments of Sunnism. Okay, and the book has attracted many commentaries. One of the most important commentaries on this book is by Sa'ad-din Taftazani, who died in 793, 1390. Okay, and there are many super commentaries that have been written on the Aqidah Nasafiyya, what are called in Arabic the Hawashi. Now, what's really important when you open this book, and I think there are English translations available of this book, is that when you open the commentaries, right at the beginning, the first section of the book takes what's called a foundational position of epistemic justification, right? So it's based on foundationalist position of epistemic justification. I'm going to go through what foundationalism is in the next few minutes once we go through the chapter, but it talks about how do we know things, right? How do we justify things? How do we know truth? What's called epistemology. How do we know something is true or not as well, right? And the author in the introduction of the book, just for your benefit, just to get an idea for those of you who've never read this book or who are wondering what this book indeed is about, what the author does right at the outset of the book is he outlines briefly three means, what's called asbab to knowledge. What are the three means of knowledge? The first one is what's called al-hawas as-salima, which is healthy senses, so your senses. Number 2 is what's called the al-khabar as-sadiq, which is a truthful report that you've received. And the third one is called the aql, the intellect as well. Okay, and in fact, Abu Hafs al-Nasafi, he actually summarizes his teacher Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi, who died in 508 1144, and he is also known as the major consolidator of the classical Maturidi school tradition. This is a book that's important. Here's one of them. I'll just share it with you. It's called Tafsiratul Adillah. It's available in 2 volumes. What Abu Mu'in Maymun ibn Muhammad al-Nasafi states in that book, knowledge is only acquired or achieved by rational inquiry. Right? We look at evidence, and this must be based or founded upon epistemic sources of the senses and necessary knowledge. Right? So we must be based, our knowledge, our what we know as truth must be based on our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we taste, etc., but also through necessary knowledge, what's called badaha fil uqul, right? But remember that the explicit defense of theology or kalam for gaining certain knowledge is really given its first real expression in a book called Talkhis al-Adillah by someone called Abu Ishaq al-Safar, who died in 534 1140. He was actually a contemporary of Abu Hafs, the book that I've just shown you. And he says in his book that there are 3 means to knowledge, right? As the proof leading to certainty, what's called al-dalila al-muwassil ila al-yaqeen, right? We need certainty. And so the source of all these books really goes back to our author, Imam Maturidi, the scholar that we really want to discuss. And he has distinctive epistemological introductions. And we really have his book. This is one of the editions, Kitab al-Tawheed, written by Imam Maturidi himself, Abu Mansur Muhammad bin Muhammad al-Maturidi al-Samarqandi. He's really the founding father of the Maturidi school. And I'm going to talk about him and his book now, through which many of us follow in terms of our theology. It's a theological school that we follow. That's why we have legal schools in Islam. In Sunnism, for example, we have the Hanafi school, we have the Shafi'i school, we have the Hanbali school, we have the Maliki school. In theology, we have a number of schools, and one of them is what's called the Maturidi school, which is named after our author, Imam Maturidi, a very important scholar. I would say he's very much underappreciated compared to other scholars in the same field as well. And he says he has what's called a correspondence theory of knowledge. What does that even mean? Correspondence theory of knowledge. What it basically means is that there are different aspects of the world which reaches us, right, via a number of means. And so we make sense of the world. We know about the world. We know about truth, not just from one source, from a number of sources, whether it's through the senses, whether it's through the intellect, whether it's something that we've received from people before us. So his worldview is what's called non-foundationalist, right? So his way of justifying the world, because he takes from different sources to make sense and he brings them together to create a coherent worldview. That's what's called a non-foundationalist outlook as well. So that's his way of justifying, if you like, as well. So instead, Imam Maturidi highlights the centrality of tradition itself in constituting any epistemic activity, and what it implies that he has what's called a comprehensive metaphysical system, right? And so this has what's been missed by people who inherited the school later on, right, in seeking to establish a classical foundational position. So this is really important. Imam Maturidi, when you read his works, he's not just taking one source. He's looking at multiple sources to make sense of the world, to know truth as well. And so, in fact, when you read this book, the Kitab al-Tawheed, you'll find theological solutions, answers to many familiar problems that we find in theology. And later on, in the next video, I hope, we will look at the originality of his system, right? He engaged with multiple, diverse, and many theological discourses of his time, right? And in fact, one of the key arguments Dr. Harvey makes in the book is that a critical rereading of Imam Maturidi is often more useful than settle consensus of the latest school. In other words, read what the author is saying himself rather than what other people are saying about it or how other people have understood his work, right? And you will gain a lot more. And obviously, that requires a lot of hard work, right? I mean, it's not easy to read this text, it's quite a difficult text itself. But Dr. Harvey, to his credit, has invested incredible energy and time in making this book accessible for me and you as well. So he deals, I mean, if you go through the book, what he begins with, let me just take you through the book briefly as a journey. What he does is he deals with the diversity of religions. There's so many religions out there, there's so many sects out there. Which one is true? Which one should we follow? Right? And he says you can only work this out through tradition, what you've inherited from people before you, right? And reason, right? Which one is true from all these religions, all these claimants to truth, right? And he says there are three paths to knowledge. One of them is your senses. Number two is what you've received, reports. And number three is through rational inquiry. These are the three ways that you will know truth. Very, very important. And we are all part of a tradition. Whether you're a Muslim or not, you base your worldview on what you've inherited from people that have come before you. So, but you also use your senses, your intellect rather, and you also use your senses. So in Islam, we are open, if we are following this particular theological school, to multiple ways of making truth, knowing truth rather. Right? We're not exclusivists. We say, oh, there's only one way, which is the Quran, right, or the Sunnah. Yes, that's true, but if you really think about it, even to accept the Quran, even to accept the Prophet, peace be upon him, right, you still have to reason. And that's what scholars always do. They say, well, if you're going to accept the Quran as truth, you must have gone through some sort of reasoning to say, well, I'm taking the Bible, or I'm taking the Quran, or I'm taking this book or that book as a form of guidance, or I'm taking this person or this religion or that religion. You must have reasoned it out. Otherwise, you're just blindly following, right? So this is important as well. Now, obviously, someone might say, well, if you're going to say that there are diverse religion and sects, right? One of the accusations that might come up to Imam Maturidi, and we see this today as well, that there's this idea of relativism, right? That it's that traditional authority is equally available to everyone by declaring the need in public debate to supplement one's tradition with rational evidence to justify truth claims. In other words, that to avoid saying that, oh, all religions are true. No, you have to justify why you've taken a particular religion or particular idea or particular worldview, whatever it may be. You have to be able to justify it. So if I'm a Muslim, why do I follow Islam as opposed to Christianity, as opposed to Judaism or anything else? You have to justify it, okay? And he, in fact, in the book, when you read the Arabic himself from the author, he actually proceeds in the book to do just that. He says members of any community, presumably they would be the Muslim community, to rationally justify their belief. Okay, so he this is a passage from the book actually itself, and I'm going to read it out to you in English and not the Arabic. He says, the one, i.e. the Prophet, who is referred to in religion such that he obligates its validation, possesses the truth, and it is incumbent upon everyone to know the truth about their religion, just as he who practiced it first has surrounded them with the evidence of his truthfulness and his testimony of it. Just like the people who were the first recipients of the revelation, right? Thus, he says, the ultimate point of the evidence possessed by them is to compel their intellects to submit to it were it to be acquired. Indeed, it is manifest for the person whom I have mentioned above, right? The person who comes. It is not possible that similar evidence is manifest for his opponent in religion, as this would mean a conflict in rational evidence, after the first set is already preponderant. In this way, a falsity of confusion is manifest in other than him. You can only follow something, and you have to make a choice. You have to follow one way after you've rationally deliberated over it. Yes, Maturidi is a school of theology. It's a very rational school of theology. Must be read, must be studied. Okay. And obviously, this person is referring to a prophet, the Prophet Muhammad in this case, as the paradigm of truth and the rationally justifiable source of traditional authority, right? This is what he's referring to. So the one who comes, you have to reason that this person must be truthful, right? To be able to follow him and to be able to take him as someone that you can reach out to. Now he doesn't say that he actually says that if you are going to follow religion, then you have to have reason and you need to have tradition as well, right? So he creates this dyad, which is like you need to have both of these. You need to have reason. It has to make sense that you have to follow this perfect person because he's truthful. It's there. It makes sense to you. And then whatever he says, you have to follow that as well. That is true as well. Okay. So this is something to bear in mind as well. Now, the author says that I propose that revised evidentialism is a good fit to the picture that Imam Maturidi presents. Okay. Now, he says Imam Maturidi admits that most people will never question the beliefs that are handed down to them by authority. Most of us just, whatever our imam, our priest, our rabbi, or whatever else it may be, we just follow them. We're born Muslims in most cases, and we follow them. But he says, look, the problem is that there are rival religions out there. There are rival systems out there. And people will say, well, I believe in this one, right? So it must be possible, he says, for members of the community, certain members of that community, theologians like our author Imam Maturidi, to rationally justify their own religious truths. Not everybody can do it, but there must be people as Muslims, as scholars, theologians, who can, in this sea of various religions, justify why they believe rationally that their religion, their worldview, their choice is the right one. Okay. But he says the process is not foundationalist, but what you do is the way you do this is you use a wide array of inferential methods, right, which are drawn from tradition. So you're using various methods. You can't just say, well, why do you believe Islam is true? Because the Quran says so. That's a circular argument. But then you have to believe the Quran is true. Well, why do you believe the Quran is true? So can you see you're going around in circles? Right? He says, no, you've got to bring together rational ways of knowing, reason. You've got to use your senses, right? And you've also got to have tradition as well. So this is a meta level of discourse, if you like. And he creates what's called, he sketches what the author says is a political philosophy. And his thesis, Imam Maturidi's thesis, if you like, is that the dual foundation, what's called asal, of tradition, sama. We call it sama because the word tradition is sama, that you hear it from people before you. You've heard this. Inna wajadna aba'ana. We've heard this from our forefathers. So this is sama. This is why we call tradition in Islam sama, which comes from the word sami'a, to hear. Okay? But he says that you have what you receive from your forefathers, but you also have reason, aql. And this mandates society to be based on religion and human beings to seek aid from it. Okay. He says right away, there is no escape for any human being for us to start without some form of tradition. We are all part of a tradition. We are all part of some tradition that we have inherited from our parents, for example, as well. Right. In fact, this worldview undercuts this idea of foundationalism because the process of knowledge acquisition assumes a set of background assumptions in social context, language, and so on. So in other words, it undercuts this view of Imam Maturidi is not foundationalist. He's saying No, a lot of these things are inherited. You've got them. You've inherited them from people around you. You might be born in England, and a part of England where there are no Muslims, and you've just inherited a Christian worldview, for example. Or you might be living in a part of the country where there are atheists. That's your worldview. You might be living with Muslims. That's your worldview. You're going to inherit, but you come from that as well. And so, what Imam Maturidi does is he draws upon what's called Platonic philosophical tradition, where he says, for example, that the philosophers term, i.e., the human being, the microcosm, proposing that both the world at the macro level and the human being at the micro level contain diverse natures that tend to pull apart. We're just living in this world, and we're all being pulled and in different directions. Later on in his book, Imam Maturidi, he uses this observational argument, because this is what he observes. He sees, look, people are following different worldviews, different ideas, right? So he says he actually uses this as an argument, in fact, for the existence of a wise creator who sustains these aspects of creation. There are different varieties of creation. Now, in his present section that I want to focus on, he looks at society, and what he does, he says, look, human beings must behave correctly. He's reasoning this. Human beings must behave correctly to avoid falling into social corruption and rejecting the divinely guided wisdom that is integral to their existence. There must be a means, for him it's religion, that enables them to fulfill their higher purpose to know God. In other words, religion orders society, right? And so from this conclusion, Imam Maturidi, he's reasoning out, is that you have two things that come out of this. The first is that if the proper function of religion is in society established, then so is the obligation for human beings given their needs. Okay, so he's providing a rational argument for why human beings are obliged to accept the dictates of religion, including divine laws. Like, you just need it, otherwise there'd be chaos, right? If you don't have some form of regulating society. For us is Islam, right? Islam is not just a private thing, it's a very public thing, right? You need some way to regulate society, which for us is divinely ordained. Otherwise, there's going to be mass chaos. Second, he says, human beings are needy, right? We require someone to explain religion to us and to lead us as well. Now, he doesn't explicitly say who that might be, but he has the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the final prophet in Islam, to be sent to humankind, in mind. Okay, so he's doing this as well. This is something to bear in mind as well. So he's reasoning this, like he's not even telling you right now that you must accept the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a final messenger or someone to follow. You must accept the Quran as truth. He's saying, look, just think about it. You need order in society. You need some sort of structure in society. Which one do you follow? Right? So we need something to do it. Okay. And then in the same kitab, in this book of Kitab al-Tawheed, in the first pages, he also talks about how do you know something is good? How can good be known, right? And this is when it gets really interesting. How do you know something is good? How do you know something is right or wrong? He says there's four candidates. There's four ways that you can know whether something is good, husn, as we say in Arabic. One is personal intuition. One is spiritual insight. Number three might be, he says, drawing lots, a bit like lottery. And he says, oh, it might be physiognomy. Okay. And he says you need to know this. And he rejects other forms of knowledge as well. Okay. But he says, look, these are different ways. But he says the path to reach knowledge of the reality of things is three things. Right? If you want to know the reality of things, we're not postmodern here, where we have a foundation. He says, if you want to know the reality of something, you're going to need three things: perception, what is called iyan, so perception. Number two is reports, what's called akhbar in Arabic. And number three is what's called nazar, inquiry, intellectual inquiry. So perception, senses, if you like; reports, what you've received; tradition; but you also need inquiry as well. one author who's written on Imam Maturidi quite extensively, he has a book on this. He says that Imam Maturidi's commitment to this triad, this trilogy, if you like, as well, of sources is sustain his method of construction for theological arguments. So when he makes arguments, he will not only reason, he will not only use his senses, but he will also use what he has received as well. Okay, so Muslims do this all the time. We are critical in what we receive and how we engage with our tradition as well, right? So, in fact, what he does in his book is whenever he wants to justify a position, he will at least use two of them, right? And he will argue from as many different sources as he is able to do so, right? Whether that's senses, whether that's tradition, Quran or Sunnah, or whether that's rational, right? And he doesn't see them, right? He doesn't see these arguments as individually providing absolute certainty, but working together. They work together to secure epistemic certainty. Subhanallah. So that's really interesting to bear in mind, right? So he is doing what's called a correspondent theory of knowledge. He's corresponding all of these knowledges, things of truth, Quran, Sunnah, tradition, reason, senses. He's bringing them all together to know truth as well, right? So this is something to bear in mind as well. In fact, Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi in this book here, Tafsiratul Adillah, in this book in here, he actually summarizes Maturidi's definition of knowledge as follows: a quantity that by it the thing mentioned is realized for the one whom it is established within. Sifatun yatajalli biha liman qamat hiya bihi ala al-mazkur. Right? And so let's go through those three methods. Let's go through the senses, let's go through reports, and let's go through intellectual inquiry. So Imam Maturidi talks about senses. He says that the senses provide a consistent picture of empirical reality between human beings, right? And it furnishes knowledge. The senses give you knowledge which you cannot oppose except if you're ignorant, right? So he's working from a sense of realism, right? And he also has conversations. He has people like agnostics in mind who neither argues for nor entirely rejects the external existence of things. So even an agnostic person wouldn't deny this as well. But Imam Maturidi says that the denier is trapped in a paradox, because he asks the question, do you know what you reject? Or with gallows of humor, he says, suggests that he be subjected to intense pain by cutting off his limbs to stop his obstinacy. Like this is senses. Like you'd have to be really arrogant, a completely ignorant person to deny the senses. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one are reports, and this is the second way of knowing truth, the epistemological truth as well. And usually there are two types in at least like the Hanafi tradition. There's tawatur, there are hadith or Quran verses or the Quran which we've received via mass transmission, tawatur, and they cannot conceivably be erroneous, right? And they don't require individual assessment of the variety of their narrators. And so tawatur is basically hadith or knowledge that's received by us, which are overwhelmed by the sheer level of corroboration. It makes it intellectually, mentally compelling that you have to accept it. Okay, and it's interesting because he looks at jurists and he says, look how these jurists who are individually the fuqaha, as we call them in Arabic, these jurists in the Sunni Islamic tradition, individually they are fallible, they can make mistakes, but they secure certainty for those rules upon which they agree. It is, he argues, God's kindness that allows these jurists to find consensus despite their differing desires. All these jurists individually can make mistakes, can make errors, but when they come together independently, they come to the truth, right? So this is what's called ijma. It's a form of evidence in our tradition, and so these jurists coming together has the same status as what's called a tawatur, mass transmitted report as well. Okay. So this is something to bear in mind as well. So let's move on to, we've talked about juristic consensus. These are scholars coming together as well. And I've talked about the idea that God's grace facilitates, yuwaffiqu, the jurist agreement on truth despite their differing desires. And this should not be, he says, construed as a suspension of their free choice in ijtihad and a compulsion to choose a single ruling, right? Like Imam Maturidi's consideration of tawatur, mass transmissions, which are, you just can't deny them, right? It must mean, he says, that God has constituted human beings in such a way that the concurrence of their natural faculties on a question of juristic reasoning justifiably overwhelms the individual probabilistic nature of the enterprise. So that's such a powerful statement by Imam Maturidi, right? Like they've all come to some sort of agreement that's telling you there's some truth there. Okay. So while Imam Maturidi is trying to find truth and making claims upon epistemology, it also has obviously implications for legal authority. And I want to make an important point here, theological stroke legal point. And I think this is really important. It shows the flexibility that is found within Islam, Sunniism, if you like, as well, in particular, that the concurrence of views in one generation is not binding for future generations. So in his other book, what is called the Ta'wilat al-Quran, this is a lovely book, the Ta'wilat al-Quran. It's in like number of volumes. What we find in there, he argues that consensus indicates the presence or absence of the underlying cause for a given ruling. So there's this is important. Now, according to his principle, if the underlying cause were to disappear, if the underlying cause for a legal ruling were to disappear due to a change in social or other circumstances, one would expect this to lead to the consensus on the topic breaking down and rule changing as well. So societal factors, society and their understanding of the world is also a factor that the jurists consider as well. Okay, so that's the second of the triad. We've looked at senses, we've looked at tradition. What is the third method for gaining epistemological certainty? And that is human reason, right? And this is something that Imam Maturidi is very much focused on. I'm going to briefly touch upon it before I conclude this session with you. Human inquiry, what we call nazar. We call it nazar. Nazar means to look, but it's like looking with the intellect, right? You're really reflecting upon this deeply as well. This is the linchpin of Imam Maturidi's epistemology, right? I mean, yes, Quran and Sunnah, yes, senses, but if you really think about it, you really study it, he reasons these things out as well. Now, he obviously follows Aristotle in assuming that human inquiry utilizes sense perception for its initial raw materials. But he says, like, he makes it the ultimate arbiter of truth over both sense data and reports. So whenever you receive reports from previous generations, what you see with your senses, your eyes, your ears, and so forth, yes, those two things are there. But the ultimate one in the triad is reason. Okay. And he says this is because many things are too remote or subtle for the senses to apprehend. Right? Your senses can make mistakes, in fact. And reports need to be scrutinized. Right? For example, do we know this is authentic? So forth, right? So these things, they require investigation and so forth as well. And they are prone to errors. There's it's a probabilistic nature in of itself. But in Imam Maturidi's view, human inquiry is able to proceed from the rational necessity of wisdom underlying the creation to an inference of the self-subsistence of the Creator and His eternality. Because you can work this out, that there is a self-subsistent Creator who doesn't need anybody else, and His eternality. He mentions this in his book Kitab al-Tawheed. He mentions all of these arguments in his Kitab al-Tawheed. If you read it, you'll find the arguments there. Okay. Now, the point of departure, and I'm coming to the end, for this investigation into al-Maturidi's epistemology was the contention that he cannot be read as a foundationalist. What does that mean? In the sense that he understood, that was understood by his successors. That's going to be next video. They were very foundational. Imam Maturidi wasn't, right? He was willing and pretty comfortable with taking from multiple sources, right? So the complex activities of the transmission of reports and rational inquiry operate within the contingent categories of human tradition and reasons, which they should not be conflated. In other words, Imam Maturidi seems to implicitly acknowledge that human beings are never free from the existing tradition. You don't just start from zero, right? You start from something that you've inherited, in which they stand and through which reports are accessed and inquiry made, right? Whatever you receive, you're going to have to filter it, right? There's a rational filter. And Muslims do this every single time, or they should do this every single time. So this is a non-foundationalist rereading of Maturidi's project, not a foundationalist one, because we've proved it now. And so what this does, interestingly, is that it opens the way to use contemporary philosophical approaches. We can use knowledge from today, right? Contemporary approaches to tradition, and we can constructively build upon his theological ideas, just like he did when he was around. He took from the Greeks, he used the Quran, he used tradition, he used reason, he used his senses, and he used the tools that were accessible and available to him to understand truth as well, right? So this leads to a general conclusion, apparently not developed explicitly by Imam Maturidi, that the systematic use of reason is always drawn from the modes of discourse characteristic of a particular tradition, right? You have to do that as well. And so, in his time, for example, he took his regime of reason, his ways of reason. They weren't Islamic. Where did he get these ways of arguing or reasoning? From Aristotelian Neoplatonic ideas, from the Aristotelian Neoplatonic tradition. This is where he got it from. So he's saying, well, if Imam Maturidi, who many of us follow, right, at least in theology or his school, and the founding father was doing this, then we can also, in a similar way, use contemporary philosophical approaches, right, to understand truth and make sense of the truth. Okay. Now, before we move on to the development of the Maturidi tradition and relevant modern perspectives on traditional reason, what our author wants to do, and I'll do this in the next video, is I want to go into the history and nature of the philosophical assumptions underlying his system. So what I want to do in the next video, God willing, is to go through the genealogy of Maturidi's theology. And I want to show you the differences that occurred after him. So what did a man himself say? What did Imam Maturidi himself say? What was his worldview? Which is what we've done in this video, I hope. But what happened afterwards? What happened when people came after him and were from his tradition? Did they follow his line of thinking, his openness to other modes of thinking? And I'll do that, God willing, in the next video. As always, I hope you found that useful and beneficial. And I will see you all in the next video, inshallah, God willing. Until then, take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.